I was talking to Phil before we started. He was saying that quite a few of you have just kind of recently started coming to Oak Hall, so there's lots of faces I don't recognize. I sort of pop back every year or two. It's actually probably been 3 now, I think, since I was here because of all the crazy stuff going on recently. But there's lots of faces I don't actually recognize this morning, and it's great to see new people kind of coming into the orbit of the church and feeling settled here. But I don't know whether you're used to the Bible or not. Sometimes for those of us who are a bit more familiar with the Bible, we are so used to hearing stories like this that it doesn't strike us as odd that we're all gathering together on Sunday morning, giving up an hour or whatever of our time to listen to a story like this that seems so alien, so insignificant, so obscure. Because it does, doesn't it? I mean, if a lot of people were to kind of peer in and eavesdrop on what we're doing, they'd wonder, why on earth are these people coming to hear of an ancient, unnamed lady from a village that you've never heard of who acted as a refugee for a while and then came back? Will she get justice? I mean, it's not the question everyone's asking, is it? Or this king, again, from an ancient kingdom that we probably have heard nothing about, whose name we can't remember. Will he get better? It's not really the pressing question of our day, or a coup d'etat in the same empire. Why are we taking the time to explore these things? Now, I don't know if you ever ask yourself those questions or dare to ask those questions, but sometimes if we're honest, we can come to passages like this in the Bible, and if we're really real with ourselves, we can wonder, what on earth does this have to say to me now, here? There are real things that we're going through, real challenges that we face. What does a story like this one or others have to say? And what I sometimes find helpful when I'm faced with that kind of predicament is to almost take a step back from the story and try and see within the pages of these kinds of stories the God whose fingerprints are everywhere. To notice what these stories teach us about the God of this book, the God of the Bible. And often, if I can catch a glimpse of him in these stories, that's when these stories have such power. And that's what I'm hoping God's going to show us today. There are 2 scenes here. They're kind of different stories. You probably noticed. One about this lady from Shunem, and then another story about a guy called Ben-Hadad and whether he gets better or not and what happens to his servant. And so we're going to take the 2 scenes one at a time and just walk our way through and try and make sense of them and what they might say to us this morning. So the first one, you heard it there. There's a woman who's at the center of the first scene. And if you were here a few weeks back, I'm not sure quite when you covered it, but chapter 4 of 2 Kings, you will have been introduced to her, this Shunammite woman. She lived with her family in a village right at the top of Israel. It's kind of en route of a major highway that comes in and out of the nation. And so often people who traveled, like the prophet Elisha, would travel pretty much past their front door. And she and her family were really hospitable to Elisha. Do you remember? They used to put him up every time he was traveling by. They even built this little extension, like a kind of crash pad on their roof with a bed and stuff, so he could just stay there whenever he needed to. And to cut a long story short, you can read it or you can listen back to the sermon from a few weeks back. This woman had a son who died. And amazingly, miraculously, one of the most incredible miracles of the whole Old Testament, God brings this dead son back to life through Elisha. It's astounding, isn't it? And I guess with all that Elisha and this family from Shunem went through, they were close to each other. And so when Elisha discovers that there's going to be this terrible famine, that the whole nation is going to be plunged into food scarcity that we can't even imagine, he said to the woman, take your family and go wherever you can to have food, to escape from this awful scarcity. And so she goes and she spends 7 years, best part of a decade, living as a refugee in another place. And then when things get a bit better, she returns home. But this challenging time that she's been through is compounded by the fact that she discovers that her home is gone, that her house and her land is gone. I mean, we don't know whether it's sort of passed into the ownership of the crown, a bit like things do in our setup. If there's no next of kin, then someone's estate might pass back to the monarch, or whether someone just took it opportunistically. They nabbed her land. So she comes back, and this is disastrous in a culture where there's no welfare state, to have nowhere to live and no way of providing for your family. I mean, it's a terrible situation. And so she reaches the conclusion the only thing she can do is to go and to appeal to the king. That's the only option open to her. Now we come to our story. Let's pick it up in verse 4. It's helpful sometimes to read back through these things. I never pick up all the details the first time through. This woman has made up her mind. She needs to go to the king. And then we pick up in verse 4 of chapter 8. The king, at this time, was talking with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God. That's the servant of Elisha. And he said, "Tell me about the great things Elisha had done." I mean, the king probably loved to hear these stories. It's kind of entertainment at court, isn't it? Elisha is this amazing man of God, incredible miracles. The king knew some of the amazing details, but not everything. So he said, "Oh, tell me some more." And I reckon Gehazi, if I was Gehazi, I'd love telling these stories. I mean, these are kind of A-class dinner party anecdotes, aren't they? Amazing stories. And he would have reveled in every little detail, enjoyed telling them. And he's just getting to his absolute favorite story, okay? It's the story about when this Shunammite woman's son was raised to life again. I mean, that's his kind of grand finale. His real party piece is to tell this story. But look what happens in verse 5. Just as Gehazi was telling the king this story, how Elisha restored the dead to life, the woman whose son Elisha had brought back to life came to appeal to the king for her house and land. At that very moment, just think of what has kind of lined up, what has been coordinated for this moment to happen as it did. I mean, it's what most people would call coincidence, but we can see as we read through this text in the Bible, it's anything but. That this woman decides months earlier that it's time probably to return back to her home. She comes back, she realizes that she has no land. She tries to figure out what she can do. Her and her husband wrestle with this problem. Eventually, they realize there's nothing to do but to go to the king. They decide on that day, in that moment, to go and approach the king. They speak to a servant or someone who eventually allows them to enter into the king's presence. And at that very moment, Gehazi's just been chatting through some of the amazing things that Elisha did. Oh, there was this story and that one, and do you remember that day and this? And oh, by the way, the very best one was this incredible time where this Shunammite family, the son died. And then, kind of drum roll, reaching the crescendo, Elisha brought him back to life again. By the power of God, he was breathing and alive, and then knock, knock, knock. At that moment, there is an announcement. Someone has come to see you, sire. This woman has got a request for you. And in she walks. And I guess Gehazi's chin would have hit the floor. He would have been astonished at this amazing, unbelievable timing. The woman was probably wondering, I guess, what was going on here? Why was Gehazi staring at her like he was? I mean, what would she have expected? We know a bit, don't we, about how monarchy worked in that part of the world at that time in history. The kings weren't known for being generous to those who had a need. And actually, if you've been following along with this series, you'll know that the kings in Israel weren't any better than any of their neighbors. If anything, they were worse. I think the expectation probably for this woman was that maybe she held out hope she might get justice, but probably not. As well, they're just at the end of a 7-year famine, aren't they? I mean, we look at our world and think how 18 months or so of pandemic has messed with everything, has left government so fragile. Imagine what 7 years in an ancient civilization of complete famine would have done to the infrastructure. I mean, the likely thing would be that the king would say, "I'm sorry, we can't deal with this now. Come back in 6 months and maybe we'll have something for you." Perhaps she hoped she might get something. But in she walks. In she walks, and look what happens. And Gehazi says, we're partway through verse 5 here, "This is the woman, my lord, the king, and this is her son, Elisha restored to life." The king asked the woman about it, and she told him. She explained it from her point of view. He was really excited to hear this story from the horse's mouth, as it were. And it grabs his attention, doesn't it? Just the amazing coming together of this story and his interest being piqued and her walking in now. It means that things seem to be panning out very differently to what she expected. I should say, we don't know who exactly this king is. There are question marks. If you read the big fat commentaries on books like 2 Kings, there is a question mark around the chronology here. We're not told which king it is, but a good chance is that this king, his dad, was someone called King Ahab that we come across in the previous volume of Kings. And his mum was someone called Queen Jezebel. And they were famous not for showing justice to the poor, but actually on one amazing occasion, they conspired to kill an Israelite and steal his land. So this woman might have been expecting similar treatment for her. Complete injustice. the powerful stomping all over the vulnerable. But what happens? As the king is gripped by this amazing story, it says halfway through verse 6, "Then he, the king, assigned an official to her case and said to him, 'Give back everything that belongs to her, including all the income from her land, from the day she left the country until now.'" I imagine this was probably the woman's chance to see her jaw just hit the floor. She would have been astounded, amazed, wouldn't she, at this outcome? No one could have predicted it. And all of this, I think, is because of the remarkable lining up of of circumstances. What people would call coincidence, but what I would call, and I think what the Bible would call, the providence of God. You see, we see here the fingerprints of God everywhere, don't we? To line things up in such a way that the king is ready to hear her plea. The king is ready to respond kindly. And as the exception, definitely not the rule, the king shows justice to this woman. Not just here's your house back, not just here's all of your land back, but here's back payments for every single harvest you've missed over the last 7 years. Isn't that amazing? And I think what we're supposed to see here as we do what I said at the start, stand back a little bit from this story and try and figure out what it tells us about the God of the Bible. What we see here, I think, is that God cares deeply for those who follow him. He cares deeply for them. I mean, we started by recognizing that this woman is a stranger to us. We don't even know her name. Her story seems pretty irrelevant to any of us in this room, doesn't it? But her story isn't irrelevant to God. Anything but. God cares deeply about this woman. God knows her name. God has seen her tears. And God cares for her more than we could imagine. And so on this occasion, God lines things up in a remarkable way so that she is provided for. God shows that he cares. This reminds me a bit of what Jesus teaches in the Sermon on the Mount. Do you know the teaching of Jesus where he's talking about worry? We have this tendency to worry, don't we? I think it's just a human thing. It's one of our frailties, isn't it? That we struggle with worrying about all the practical things of life. But Jesus says, don't worry about what you're going to eat or drink. Don't worry about what you're going to wear. He says, take a look at the birds of the air. Look at the flowers of the field. See how God cares for them. And don't you realize he loves you so much more than them? I think often what causes us to worry is that we struggle to really take that on board, just how much God cares for us. Now, of course, for this woman, as probably for all of us in this room, every day wasn't a kind of miracle day, like the day when her son was raised from the dead or the day when her land was restored to her. There were all kinds of days in between. There were the long years of struggling as a refugee. There were the anxious hours and maybe even weeks of waiting to decide or to find out what the king would say about whether she'd get her land back. Those were difficult times. Those were times that would have stretched her faith. But we see here that God cares for her. And when we look back to see the big picture of her life, we can see without a shadow of a doubt that the God of the Bible loves her, knows her, and cares deeply for her. So that's the first scene. Let's move on to scene 2, because time is not on our side. And here we have the prophet Elisha. He's been the main character for several chapters now, seeing how God has been at work through him. And for some strange reason, we'll get to it in a minute, he travels all the way up to Damascus. You might know Damascus is in modern-day Syria. And back then it was the capital of a kingdom called Aram. And Elisha was up there, and the king of Aram, a guy called Ben-Hadad, was really ill. He thought he might die, and so knowing a bit about Elisha, maybe through one of his generals called Naaman, who was healed of leprosy a few chapters earlier, he says, well, go and find this prophet and find out from God whether I'm going to die or not. So he sends a really nice gift, 40 camels loaded up with all kinds of goodies. That sounds nice, doesn't it? And the servant, Hazael, goes with all these camels to Elisha, and he asks him the question, is my king going to survive from this illness? Now, let's just take a look at the answer that Elisha gives. It's in verse 10 of our passage, so chapter 8, verse 10. And it's a confusing answer. I'll just warn you up ahead. Elisha answered, go and say to him, you will certainly recover. Nevertheless, the Lord has revealed to me that he will, in fact, die. Now, that's confusing, right? It's confusing on a few fronts. I mean, just as you read it, it's a strange, seemingly contradictory thing to say, isn't it? But it's also confusing because maybe you've got a footnote in your Bible that tells you there's a bit of a confusion over, with some of the ancient copies of this manuscript, whether it says he will recover or he won't recover. And there's question marks that scholars ask about that. I mean, we won't dive into this. We haven't really got the time for it. But one thing just to note as we kind of pass by is I find that encouraging, that the people who translated our Bible, they're not trying to pull the wool over your eyes. When there's anything like this, where in the manuscripts there are question marks, they're completely open and transparent about it. I think there are some people who imagine that these sneaky Bible translators are trying to kind of hide all kinds of secret things from us. And it couldn't be further from the truth. It gives us a confidence that what we've got here in English is something we can rely on, something we can trust, that the people who've worked on it have been really kind of above board with everything. Anyway, I'm going to go what the NIV that I've got in front of me says, which is, he will certainly recover, but he's going to die. And I think the subtext that Elisha is trying to communicate is this. All things being equal, if everything was left as it was, he would survive. He would recover from the illness. However, he's actually going to die. That's what he's saying. And he goes on to explain a little bit why. But before he does that, he kind of fixes Hazael in his gaze. He stares him down, which I think we would all find quite awkward. And then the prophet bursts into tears. And so clearly Hazael is very awkward about this. It does make me wonder whether he's maybe a part British or something, because I think intense eye contact and kind of public shows of emotion, we struggle with that, don't we? So I wonder if Hazael is a little bit British like us. Anyway, he struggles with this. He's not sure what to make of it. And so he asks this question, why are you weeping? What's going on? Look at verse 12 with me. And the prophet answers. He says this, because I know the harm you will do to the Israelites. You will set fire to their fortified places, kill their young men with the sword, dash their children to the ground, and rip open their pregnant women. Hazael doesn't get this. I mean, he's just a servant. How would he orchestrate any of that? But Elisha explains to him that he will become the king of Aram. And this obviously kind of lights a touch paper in Hazael. He goes home to the king, and the king asks him, well, what did Elisha say? And you can see partway through verse 14, Hazael replies, he told me that you would certainly recover. But the next day, he took a thick cloth, soaked it in water, and spread it over the king's face, so that he died. Then Hazael succeeded him as king. I mean, it's a gruesome account, isn't it? But what we have here, actually, as Elisha travels up to Damascus, is him retracing the steps of his predecessor, a prophet called Elijah. It's confusing, isn't it? Elijah. But Elijah came before. And God had revealed to Elijah that Israel was basically hanging over a precipice. The axe has been waiting to fall pretty much through this whole book as Israel continues to run from God, as they continue to live as if he doesn't exist, as they continue to favor injustice over justice, as they continue to have no concern for the poor or the vulnerable or the weak or the marginalized, as they live like this rather than reflecting God as they were meant to. If you go right the way back to Abraham or to the time of Moses, you see that the reason God called Israel out was to be a people that were shaped like him, that loved like he did, that showed justice like he did, so that the world around them would see what their God was like. And in seeing their God, they would be drawn to him. They would want to know him themselves, that the whole world would discover the beauty, the glory, the compassion, the love, the mercy of God. That was the vision that God had for Israel. But now they look just like everyone else, just like the nations all around them. No distinguishing features at all. And so God's judgment had to come. And so up in Damascus, God said that he would show Elijah 3 agents of his judgment. 3 people through whom judgment would come. One was Elisha, the prophet, and now they're lining up in chapters 8 and 9. The second was a king from a foreign nation, a guy called Hazael. Ring any bells? This murderous, treacherous guy who just killed his boss and became the new king of Aram. And the final person was an Israelite king, a guy called Jehu. And we read about him in the next chapter. This incredibly violent king of Israel, who again would bring judgment. And so as Elisha kind of retraces the steps of his predecessor, And as he and Hazael and Jehu line up, we can feel that judgment is about to fall on Israel. They continue to turn their back on God, and judgment is coming. It's a frightening prospect. And this is the kind of topic that I guess if we didn't go bit by bit through books of the Bible, we would probably skirt around. Judgment isn't one of those topics that people like me like to talk about or feel comfortable talking about. It's not the kind of thing that clicks with how people think in our contemporary Western world, is it? And maybe it's because people have in their mind a view of God, the judge. They picture God kind of gleefully rubbing his hands together, imagining all kinds of cruel and malicious ways of punishing people, like he takes a sadistic pleasure in judgment. I think that's the caricature, isn't it? But this passage reveals something different to us about how God feels about judgment. As Elisha describes the rise of Hazael and what that judgment will look like for Israel, what is going on? Did you see? He's crying. And I think we're supposed to recognize that Elisha the prophet doesn't just speak for God, he also weeps for God. As we read this account that foretells terrible judgment for Israel, and as we catch a glimpse of the tear-stained face of the prophet, we are meant to see, as it were, the heart of God breaking. That's what it's like for God, to know that his children, his precious nation, his beloved ones, continue to turn from him. And to stem their evil, to contain their injustice, he has to act in judgment. It breaks his heart. And so I think if the first scene shows us that God cares deeply for those who follow him, this second scene, I think it teaches us that God cares deeply, just as deeply, for those who run from him. Whether we come to him or flee from him, whether we acknowledge him or not, God cares deeply for us. And this truth ripples down through the pages of Scripture. Because the truth is that actually it's not just in this time in Israel that injustice kind of went unchecked. It happens in our time too, doesn't it? And throughout all history. It wasn't just amongst the kings and the citizens of Israel that people ignored God and went on through their lives as if he didn't exist. That happens now too, doesn't it? It wasn't just at that time when the poor were overlooked and ignored, when the rich got their way, and often those who are most vulnerable were left out. That happens now just as much, doesn't it? And so in a way, we're all implicated in this. In just the same way that Israel were rightly facing God's judgment, we do too. But there's something incredible at the very center of our Bibles. And we're going to remember it really soon when we share together the bread and the cup. It's the cross. And at the cross, we see more clearly than anywhere else that God cares deeply, loves passionately those who run from him, those who turn their back on him. You see, there we have another act of judgment being poured out, again, foretold by prophets. Interestingly, again, with a ruler of the people of Israel and a ruler of foreign nations coming together to act in judgment as agents of God's judgment. But this time, God's wrath doesn't fall on his creation, his rebellious creation. His wrath falls on his Son. And as Jesus hangs upon the cross, as he bears the judgment that you or I deserve, he makes it possible for us to live life with him, to be forgiven, to have a fresh start, to begin again. As God's judgment hangs over a world that needs to have evil dealt with, that must have injustice stomped out, as God promises a new future hope of a new creation put right with the world, with all the wrong in the world stripped out again, we have the possibility of joining with God in that, of starting again, of living lives forgiven, fresh, new beginnings because of what Jesus has done for us. In just a moment, we're going to sing and we're going to respond and we're going to pray and we're going to eat together and drink together to remember what Jesus has done for us. We see so clearly here God's care for us. Now, I wonder if these stories still feel quite alien to you. And we started by recognizing that. We have to recognize that these stories seem ancient and strange and maybe a bit insignificant to our lives. Perhaps they still feel a little bit like that to you. Maybe even as we talked about the cross of Jesus, it feels a bit far off and distant to you. But this morning, I want all of us to just step back a moment and see, as clearly as we can, that the God depicted here in these scenes cares for those who trust him, and he cares for those who run from him. He cares for all of us. He cares for you. I wonder, with different people coming this morning, perhaps you've sort of joined Oak Hall recently, perhaps there are some people here who the penny just never dropped before about this. You could barely believe that God, the God who created it all, the God of the universe, the God of the Bible, would care specifically for you, would love you with the depth that he does. But it's true. The God that we've been singing to, the God that we've prayed to this morning, the God who authored this text, he loves you more deeply than you could ever imagine. And this morning he invites you. Perhaps there are one or two here this morning, maybe a few more, who've never taken that invitation, who've never said yes to that invitation from God to come to him, to accept his forgiveness, to begin again afresh with him, a new start. Well, I can't think of any better thing to do this morning than that, to respond to that invite from him, the God who cares passionately for you. If that's you and you feel, yeah, maybe God is inviting me this morning, I want to say yes to him, then do come and talk to Andy. You can come and chat to me or Phil or others that you know here, perhaps a Christian who invited you along this morning. They would love to talk more with you about that and share what it means for them to have taken that step. But I'm going to pray now as we close. I want us to understand that simple truth this morning, that God cares for us. And we're going to enact that together as we eat and as we drink together in just a moment. But why don't we pause now as we pray, and I'll ask Andy to come and join with us. Father, thank you so much for that wonderful truth, that in obscure stories from ancient history, people that we don't even know, we see that you care for them. And it opens our eyes to see that if you care for obscure people from ancient history, you might care for obscure, unimportant people like us in the present day too. Thank you that, Lord, because of the cross, we can have no doubt of your care for us, that you love us more deeply than we can ever imagine. And Lord, I pray for anyone here this morning who doesn't know that themselves, deep in their heart, who doesn't know the love that God has for them. Lord, would you open their eyes to see? Would they discover this morning just how passionately, how deeply, how profoundly you love them? Lord, I pray that each of us would know that more powerfully today, we pray, and in greater depth. We ask this all in Jesus' precious name. Amen.